The wedding ceremony was engineered with the precision of a military campaign. Every detail had been negotiated between Thalvarian and Human Federation diplomatic corps. The blend of cultural traditions, the exact wording of vows, the symbolic gestures that would satisfy both populations watching the broadcast. Ambassador Ethan Cross stood on the elevated ceremonial platform in the Grand Hall of the Thalvarian Imperial Palace, wearing formal attire that had required 4 fittings and extensive cultural consultation. The outfit merged human and Thalvarian aesthetics in ways he hoped looked dignified rather than absurd. Beside him, Queen Aysara of the Thalvarian Empire wore traditional coronation regalia updated for the occasion. The formal robes were deep purple with silver threading that caught the light, and the ceremonial crown sat perfectly on her dark hair, its design incorporating the distinctive long ear ornaments that marked Thalvarian nobility and enhanced her species' natural elegance. She was striking in a way that Ethan's brain registered as aesthetically impressive rather than romantically attractive. The uncanny valley worked in reverse with Thalvarians, close enough to human to appreciate the beauty while being alien enough that it didn't trigger romantic response. Which was fine. This wasn't about romance. Queen Aysara needed human technological expertise to modernize her empire's aging infrastructure and defense systems. The Federation needed access to Thalvarian mineral resources and strategic positioning in a region where 3 rival powers competed for influence. A formal marriage alliance, an ancient Thalvarian tradition carrying more legal force than any treaty, solved both problems efficiently. Ethan spoke his vows in carefully rehearsed Thalvarian, the translator implant ensuring his pronunciation was acceptable if not perfect. The words translated roughly to, "I bind myself to your purpose and offer my capabilities in service of our shared interests." Remarkably unromantic, but that was Thalvarian culture, pragmatic to a degree that made human bureaucracy seem sentimental by comparison. Aysara spoke her vows in standard, her accent carrying the musical quality that came from vocal anatomy evolved for a tonal language. "I accept your binding and offer reciprocal obligation in pursuit of mutual advantage." The assembled dignitaries applauded with appropriate diplomatic enthusiasm. Somewhere in Federation space, Ethan's daughter was probably rolling her eyes at the absurdity of her father's political marriage. Somewhere in Thalvarian territory, nobles were calculating economic benefits. Neither bride nor groom was thinking about love, companionship, or any of the reasons humans typically married. This was strategic alliance formalized through ceremony, legalized through binding contracts that spanned 2 species. After the ceremony, they stood together for the mandatory reception, exchanging pleasantries with diplomats who congratulated them on successful negotiations rather than wishing them happiness. The distinction was telling. That evening, after the last guest departed and official duties concluded, Ethan retreated to his new quarters in the palace's consort wing. The rooms were spacious, elegantly appointed, and felt absolutely nothing like home. They felt like what they were, accommodations for a foreign official who happened to have a fancy title. He reviewed the briefing materials outlining his formal duties as royal consort. Ceremonial appearances, coordination of Federation aid programs, serving as diplomatic liaison between human interests and Thalvarian governance. Essentially, his job as ambassador with additional formal obligations and significantly more elaborate clothing requirements. Ethan could work with that. He'd spent 23 years in the diplomatic corps navigating complex political situations. This was just another assignment, albeit one that came with a permanent legal bond and public scrutiny. He expected the marriage to proceed exactly as negotiated. Professional cooperation, mutual benefit, formal politeness, eventual success, achieving diplomatic objectives both governments had established. What he didn't expect was that 4 months later, during a crisis that threatened regional stability, he'd discover that Queen Aysara was not just competent, which he'd known from their pre-marriage briefings, but genuinely interesting to work with in ways that had nothing to do with political utility. The northern border crisis erupted with the subtlety of a military strike. Three provinces with separatist movements, backed by external powers seeking to destabilize Thalvarian control, launched coordinated attacks on government facilities. Within hours, Aysara was managing a multi-front crisis that threatened to spiral into regional conflict. Ethan found himself working 20-hour days alongside her, not because protocol required it, but because his experience with insurgent movements and back-channel negotiations proved valuable. She was brilliant, strategic thinking was sharp, political instincts were excellent, decision-making was decisively efficient. But what struck Ethan most was her absolute emotional control. She made decisions affecting millions of lives with the same cool calculation she might use to choose dinner. When she authorized a military strike that would neutralize separatist leadership, but inevitably cause civilian casualties, she delivered the order without visible hesitation. Ethan didn't question the decision. He agreed it was strategically necessary. But 2 hours after she'd given the order, he found her alone in the strategy room at 2 a.m., staring at a tactical display showing projected casualty numbers. The decision was strategically sound, he said quietly, not approaching too close. Aysara glanced at him briefly. I know. The mathematics are unambiguous. Projected casualties from this action, approximately 200. Projected casualties from continued insurgency without intervention, over 1,000. The calculation is straightforward. Calculations being straightforward doesn't make the decision comfortable to live with. Live with. Aysara's tone suggested genuine confusion with the phrase. Knowing your decision will result in deaths. Even when it's the right choice, it carries weight. It's okay to acknowledge that. Aysara turned to face him fully, and Ethan could see her processing this statement like it was in a language she didn't quite speak. You believe I should experience distress about necessary decisions. I think it's human and probably healthy to feel the weight of decisions that cost lives, even when those decisions are correct. You can make the right call and still acknowledge the cost. That seems inefficient. There are 12 more crisis situations requiring immediate decisions. Emotional processing would significantly impair response time. Ethan almost smiled at the pure Thalvarian logic. Fair point. But just so you know, acknowledging difficulty doesn't make you a worse leader, might actually make you better. Aysara studied him for a long moment, expression unreadable. Finally, you have a distinctly human perspective on decision-making and emotional response. Guilty as charged. That was not criticism, merely observation. She returned her attention to the display. I will consider your perspective on acknowledging costs, but currently, there are indeed 12 more situations requiring attention. Understood. I'll be in the communications center if you need another set of eyes on any of them. Ethan left, and he didn't think much more about the exchange. A small moment of human emotional processing meeting Thalvarian pragmatism, culturally interesting but not particularly significant. What he didn't realize was that Aysara would replay that conversation repeatedly over the following days. The idea that someone could acknowledge both strategic correctness and emotional difficulty, treating those as compatible rather than contradictory, was completely foreign to everything her culture had taught her about effective leadership. And somewhere in her mind, a question began forming. What else might she be missing by viewing every relationship purely through the lens of utility and strategic advantage? The northern border crisis resolved after 8 brutal weeks through combination of military action and Ethan's negotiations with moderate separatist factions, offering political solutions that let them claim partial victory. It was successful by any measure, region stabilized, casualties minimized compared to projections, Thalvarian authority maintained. Aysara expected to return to normal governance, with Ethan resuming appropriate distance as useful but separate consort. Instead, something had shifted in ways she couldn't quite categorize, and that shift would prove more significant than any treaty or strategic alliance could ever be. After the northern border crisis resolved, Aysara expected their working relationship to return to its previous formal boundaries. Instead, Ethan continued appearing at strategy sessions even when protocol didn't require his presence. Not to dominate discussions or push Federation interests, but simply to be there, offering perspective when asked, providing thoughtful silence when not. Aysara found his presence less intrusive than she'd anticipated. One evening, after a particularly frustrating Imperial Council session where Elder Veyrath and his conservative faction had spent 3 hours obstructing necessary tax reform through procedural delays, Aysara retreated to her private study expecting solitude. Instead, she found Ethan already there, reviewing trade reports at the secondary desk she'd authorized for his use months ago. "The council was difficult today," he observed without looking up from his datapad. It wasn't a question, just acknowledgement. Aysara appreciated the lack of intrusive inquiry. "The council is perpetually difficult. They believe their role is to provide wisdom, when primarily they provide obstruction disguised as deliberation." She moved to her own desk, pulling up the evening's remaining work: budget reviews, provincial reports, diplomatic correspondence that couldn't wait until morning. Elder Veyrath wasn't actually concerned about tax reform, Ethan said after a moment. "He's positioning against your agricultural subsidies from 2 months ago. The tax objections are leveraged to force concessions on the subsidies." Aysara looked up sharply. "You determined this how?" "Body language, voting patterns, who he consulted during recess. Human diplomatic training emphasizes reading subtext, what people actually want versus what they claim to want. Your nobles don't particularly hide their political maneuvering. They just assume no one's tracking the patterns beneath stated positions." Ethan finally looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "If you offered a small concession on agricultural subsidies, something that appears significant but doesn't actually alter core policy, Veyrath would probably accept it as victory and stop blocking everything else out of spite." It was solid political analysis, the kind Aysara valued because it was immediately actionable. But what struck her was that Ethan offered it without any apparent benefit to himself or Federation interests. He was helping her navigate her own council simply because he'd noticed a pattern and thought she'd want to know. "Why inform me of this?" she asked. "The tax reform benefits Thalvarian domestic policy more than Federation interests. Your government would likely prefer continued deadlock. Because you're trying to accomplish something necessary, and I can help make it marginally less difficult." Ethan returned his attention to his datapad. "That's what partners do." Partners, the word he'd used, Kethveller, translated literally as obligation co-holders. But the way Ethan employed it carried connotations the strict translation missed. Something closer to people working together by choice, rather than people bound by requirement. Over the following months, Aysara noticed patterns in Ethan's behavior that didn't conform to her understanding of useful consorts or political allies. He listened, not strategically searching for advantage or information to exploit, but simply to understand. When she explained complex policy challenges, he asked questions that helped her clarify her own thinking, rather than steering conversations toward Federation priorities. When she expressed frustration with imperial bureaucracy, he didn't offer unsolicited solutions unless she specifically requested them, just provided space for her to process aloud. When she made decisions he disagreed with, he stated his perspective clearly, but accepted her final authority without resentment or passive-aggressive resistance. It was profoundly unusual to have someone in her life who existed without apparent agenda beyond being genuinely helpful. 6 months into their marriage, after an exhausting day coordinating relief efforts following catastrophic floods in the southern provinces, 3,000 displaced, critical infrastructure destroyed, provincial governors demanding resources she didn't have. Aysara found Ethan in the palace's observatory garden at sunset. He didn't announce his presence or ask if she wanted company. He simply sat on the carved stone bench and watched the sky shift through colors that neither human nor Thalvarian languages had adequate names for. After 10 minutes of comfortable silence, Aysara asked, "Don't you have Federation coordination reports to file? Diplomatic communications requiring response?" "Probably, but they can wait an hour. You looked like you needed quiet company more than I needed to complete routine paperwork." Quiet company is not a productive use of time. "Not everything needs to be productive," Ethan said, still watching the sunset. "Sometimes being present with someone who's had a difficult day has value even when nothing tangible gets accomplished." He turned to look at her. "How many people in your life are present because they choose to be, rather than because duty or advantage requires it?" Aysara wanted to argue with this assessment but found she couldn't. Her council served because their positions required it. Her staff worked for salary and security. Her subjects obeyed because she was their sovereign. Her family, what remained after the assassination that killed her parents, maintained relationships out of dynastic obligation. Even Ethan was present because political necessity had brought him here. Or at least, that's why he'd arrived initially. But sitting here in the gardens, having conversations that served no diplomatic purpose, spending time together that generated no measurable strategic benefit, that wasn't required by any treaty or marriage contract. "I should return to work," Aysara said, though she made no move to stand. "There are 17 provincial reports requiring review before morning session. The reports will still be there in an hour. The sunset won't." Ethan's tone was gentle, not pressing. "But if you need to work, I understand. I'll be here if you want quiet company, or I'll leave if you prefer solitude. Your choice." Aysara stayed. They watched the sunset in silence, and when she finally returned to her study an hour later, she found her mind clearer, and her stress measurably reduced despite having accomplished nothing tangible. It was inefficient and illogical, and somehow valuable in ways she couldn't quite articulate. 7 months into their marriage, Aysara began noticing something else. She'd started looking forward to encounters with Ethan. Not for political utility or strategic coordination, but simply because his company had become something she enjoyed for reasons that had nothing to do with advantage. When she had successes, she found herself wanting to share them with him. When she faced challenges, his perspective became one she actively sought. When she had rare free moments, the observatory garden, where she knew she might encounter him, became her default retreat. This was concerning in ways she didn't have frameworks to process. One evening, after a particularly successful negotiation with a rival power that had concluded more favorably than expected, Aysara found herself in the observatory garden before consciously deciding to go there. Ethan was already present, as she'd somehow known he would be. "Good day," he asked, not looking up from the small datapad he was reading. "Successful. The Varanth Collective agreed to terms significantly more advantageous than projected. Our negotiating position was stronger than their intelligence suggested." "That's excellent. You've been working on Varanth relations for months. Must feel good to see it pay off." Aysara sat on the bench beside him. When had that become automatic rather than requiring conscious decision? And felt something unfamiliar. Not pride in strategic success, which she understood. Something else. Pleasure at sharing the success with someone who'd understand what it meant. "You seem pleased," Ethan observed, and there was warmth in his tone that had nothing to do with political calculation. "I am pleased. The success strengthens our strategic position significantly. And you wanted to tell me about it." It wasn't a question, just observation. And Aysara realized with uncomfortable clarity that it was accurate. She'd wanted to share this success specifically with Ethan, not because he needed to know for diplomatic coordination, but because why? I value your perspective on strategic matters, she said carefully. I think it's more than that. Ethan set down his datapad, giving her his full attention. I think you wanted to share something that made you happy with someone who'd be genuinely happy for you. That's normal, Aysara. That's what people do with people they care about. We have a strategic marriage. Our relationship is defined by mutual obligation and political utility. The marriage was strategic. What we've become over these 7 months is something else. His expression was patient, like he was explaining something obvious to someone who'd never encountered the concept. Aysara, when's the last time you shared personal success with someone just because you wanted to, not because protocol required it? Aysara couldn't remember, possibly never. Success had always been strategic achievement to be leveraged, not personal victory to be celebrated. Thalvarian culture doesn't structure relationships around personal emotional sharing, she said slowly. We have hierarchical bonds, political alliances, family obligations. But relationships built on choosing to share experiences purely because we value someone's reaction, that's not a framework we operate within. Just because your culture doesn't name something doesn't mean you can't experience it, Ethan said gently. You came here to tell me about your success because some part of you wanted to share it with me specifically. Because my reaction mattered to you beyond strategic value. That's friendship, Aysara. That's what it looks like. Friendship, the word existed in Thalvarian Kethvel, meaning chosen bond, but it was rarely used. Most Thalvarian relationships were Kethrai, obligated bonds structured around duty, hierarchy, or mutual advantage. I don't have friends, Aysara said. Queens don't have friends. We have allies, subjects, advisors, family. But not friends. Why not? The question was so simple it stopped her. Because friendship requires equality, and queens cannot be equal to those they rule. Because friendship requires emotional vulnerability, and rulers cannot afford vulnerability. Because friendship is chosen freely, and most relationships with queens are chosen based on what people hope to gain. Most relationships, yes, but not all. Ethan's voice was quiet but certain. I'm here because political necessity brought me. I stay in this garden having these conversations because I choose to. Because I value your company beyond what you can provide me. Because somewhere over these months, you stopped being Queen Aysara, who I'm obligated to support, and became Aysara, who I genuinely like spending time with. Aysara felt something uncomfortable settling in her chest. Not unpleasant exactly, but unsettling, unfamiliar. That seems inefficient, she said, falling back on familiar logic. Emotional attachment creates vulnerability. Caring about someone beyond their utility provides no strategic advantage. Probably true, Ethan agreed. But loneliness is also inefficient. It degrades judgment, increases stress, reduces long-term cognitive performance. Having someone you trust, who sees you as more than your role, who chooses to be present because they value you, that's not just emotional indulgence. That's maintenance of mental health and decision-making capacity. He paused, then added quietly, and sometimes things don't need strategic justification. Sometimes it's okay to just have a friend. Aysara sat with this, watching the last light fade from the sky, feeling Ethan's presence beside her, solid, comfortable, chosen rather than required. I don't know how to have a friend, she admitted finally. I was trained to rule, not to connect, to calculate, not to trust, to maintain appropriate distance, not to, whatever this is. Then we'll figure it out together, Ethan said. No rush, no requirements, just two people choosing to value each other beyond what duty demands. That's all friendship really is. They sat together in the growing darkness, and Aysara felt something shift. Not in policy or politics or strategic advantage. In something more fundamental, in her understanding of what relationships could be when they were chosen freely rather than required by position or circumstance. It was terrifying and oddly comforting in equal measure. And somehow, She knew that whatever was developing between them would prove more significant than any formal alliance could ever be. Nine months into their marriage, Aysara was forced to confront the nature of her relationship with Ethan when he did something that shocked her. He disagreed with her publicly, before witnesses, during a critical policy decision. The issue was a proposed trade agreement with the Calthani Dominion. The economic benefits were substantial: access to rare minerals, reduced tariffs, technology exchanges that would benefit multiple Thalvarian industries. Her senior economic advisors strongly recommended approval. Her council was divided but leaning towards support. The problem was that the Calthani Dominion had a troubling record on labor practices. Specifically, they maintained what amounted to slavery in their industrial sectors, though they called it contractual obligation. They also had history of territorial aggression, carefully disguised as defensive necessity. During the final policy review in the Imperial Council chamber, with her senior advisors present and the decision essentially made pending her formal approval, Ethan spoke up. "Your Majesty," he said, using her formal title because this was official business conducted before witnesses, "I believe we should reconsider this agreement." The chamber fell silent. Several advisors looked uncomfortable. Ethan was publicly questioning the Queen's stated position. Aysara felt anger flash through her, instinctive and immediate. The economic analysis is comprehensive. The strategic benefits are clear. The agreement serves Thalvarian interests. "It serves short-term economic interests," Ethan said calmly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "But the economic projections assume the Dominion will honor terms they've violated in previous agreements. We're not just risking resources. We're lending legitimacy to a regime that's enslaving their border populations. The agreement includes enforcement mechanisms, which they've circumvented before." Ethan's tone remained respectful but firm. "Your Majesty, I understand the economic appeal, but there are alternative trade partners. Harder to negotiate with, more expensive initially, but they won't put Thalvaria in the position of profiting from slavery. Some costs aren't worth the economic benefit." Elder Veyrath spoke up, clearly uncomfortable with the direction. "The consort's concerns are noted, but perhaps this discussion should continue in private rather than—" "No," Aysara interrupted, her voice cold. "The consort has raised concerns publicly. We will address them publicly." She turned her attention to Ethan. "You believe I'm making a mistake. I believe you're prioritizing short-term economic gain over long-term moral credibility." "Yes, that's a mistake." The chamber was silent enough to hear breathing. No one challenged the Queen this directly, especially not in formal council session. "Your objection is noted," Aysara said, her tone making clear the discussion was over. "The agreement will be signed as planned." Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. "As you say, Your Majesty." The session concluded, and Aysara proceeded with final approval documentation. But the anger that had flashed through her initially had been replaced by something more complex. Irritation, yes, but also discomfort that she couldn't quite identify. After the formal session ended and advisors had departed, Aysara found Ethan in the strategy room reviewing intelligence reports. She closed the door with more force than strictly necessary. "You undermined my authority before the council." Ethan looked up from his work, expression calm. "I disagreed with a decision I believe is strategically and morally wrong. That's different from undermining authority. You challenged my stated position before witnesses. In Thalvarian culture, that's considered disloyal conduct. In human culture, real loyalty means providing honest counsel, especially when it's uncomfortable." Ethan set down his datapad, giving her his full attention. "Aysara, you're the Queen. Final decision is yours, and I accept that. But my role as your advisor and as your friend is to tell you when I think you're making a mistake. Especially then. You're my consort, not my friend. I'm both. Ethan's voice was gentle but certain, and I serve you better by speaking truth than by staying silent while you make choices I believe you'll regret. If you want someone who agrees with everything you say, I'm fundamentally the wrong person for that role. But I don't think that's what you actually need. What I need is support, not public contradiction. But support means different things to different people. To me, it means honest counsel especially when it's difficult to hear. He paused. Friends tell each other hard truths. That's what makes the relationship valuable. But there was that word again. Friends. Kethvel. The chosen bond that Aysara's training had taught her was incompatible with effective rule. We are not friends. We are queen and consort, bound by strategic marriage, operating within defined hierarchical relationship. But the marriage is strategic. What we've become over these months is something else entirely. Ethan's expression was patient, like he was waiting for her to catch up to something obvious. Aysara, when's the last time someone disagreed with you because they cared about you making good decisions, rather than because they wanted to advance their own interests? Aysara wanted to argue, but found she couldn't. Her advisors disagreed with her regularly, but always with underlying agendas, political positioning, faction interests, personal advantage. Ethan had no apparent agenda beyond. What? Genuinely believing she was making a mistake. I don't need someone to care about my decisions. I need advisors who provide accurate analysis and implement my choices effectively. You need both. You have plenty of advisors. What you don't have is people who care about you beyond your utility to them. That's what I'm trying to be, even when it's uncomfortable for both of us. The argument remained unresolved. Aysara was too angry to process his perspective, and Ethan was too convinced of his position to back down. They maintained coldly formal interactions for the next 3 weeks, while the Kelthani trade agreement was finalized and implemented. Then intelligence reports began coming in. The Kelthani Dominion was violating labor provisions even more egregiously than Ethan had warned. Worse, they were using the legitimacy of Thalvarian partnership to justify their practices to other powers. If the Thalvarian Empire finds our labor practices acceptable, surely they meet reasonable standards. Aysara faced a choice. Ignore the violations and maintain the economic benefits, or publicly suspend the agreement at significant political cost. She chose the latter. The suspension was politically expensive. Conservative factions accused her of weakness, economic interests complained about lost revenue, and the Kelthani responded with diplomatic protests and trade retaliation. Through it all, Ethan worked alongside her to minimize damage and negotiate alternative arrangements. He didn't gloat about being right, didn't reference their earlier argument or claim vindication. Just provided the same steady competence he always had, helping her navigate consequences of a decision he'd opposed from the start. After the immediate crisis was managed, and alternative trade agreements were being negotiated with other partners, Aysara found Ethan in the observatory garden. It had become their place somehow, the location where important conversations happened. "You were correct about Kelthan," she said without preamble, sitting on the bench beside him. "I was right this time. You'll be right about something I miss next time. That's how it works when two people with different perspectives work together. You don't claim superiority for being proven correct." "Why would I?" Ethan turned to look at her. "I'm not competing with you, Aysara. I'm trying to help you succeed because—" He paused, seeming to choose words carefully. "Because somewhere over these months you stopped being an assignment I was obligated to fulfill and became someone I genuinely care about. Not Queen Aysara who provides strategic advantage. Aysara, who I choose to stand beside." Aysara felt that uncomfortable feeling again, the one she couldn't quite identify, that had nothing to do with political calculation or strategic advantage. Thalvarian culture doesn't structure relationships around caring beyond utility, she said slowly. We have hierarchical bonds, political alliances, family obligations. But relationships based purely on choosing to care about someone, that's foreign to our frameworks. Just because your culture doesn't name something doesn't mean you can't experience it, Ethan said, echoing his earlier observation. These past months, when we've talked in the gardens, worked late solving problems, had conversations that served no political purpose, did you continue those interactions only because they were strategically useful? Aysara wanted to say yes because that would fit comfortable categories, but honesty, a value she prided herself on even when inconvenient, demanded different answer. No, they were valuable beyond utility. I found myself anticipating them, wanting them to continue, feeling their absence when circumstances prevented them. She paused, then continued carefully. I found myself valuing your presence for reasons I couldn't justify through standard cost-benefit analysis. That's friendship, Ethan said gently. Valuing someone beyond what they provide, choosing their company because the alternative, their absence, feels like loss. You might not have cultural vocabulary for it, but you've been experiencing it. I challenged you publicly. I dismissed your concerns. I was angry with you for disagreeing with me. And I stayed. I continued working with you. I didn't withdraw or retaliate or claim superiority when I was proven right. Because friends don't abandon each other over disagreements, they work through them. Aysara sat with this, processing implications that went beyond this single incident. If we're friends, if that's what this relationship is, then you'll continue disagreeing with me when you believe I'm wrong. Yes, as respectfully as possible, but honestly. And I need to accept that honest disagreement isn't disloyalty. It's actually the opposite. The people who only tell you what you want to hear, those are the disloyal ones. They're serving their own comfort, not your actual interests. Aysara was quiet for a long moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed somehow more vivid than usual. I don't know how to have a friend. I was trained to rule, to maintain appropriate distance, to calculate relationships based on advantage, to trust position rather than people. Then we'll figure it out together, Ethan said. No requirements, no expectations beyond mutual honesty and choosing to value each other. That's all friendship really requires. That seems inefficient and emotionally risky. Probably, but the alternative, ruling completely alone, trusting no one, valuing people only for their utility, that's not just lonely. It's unsustainable. Everyone needs someone who sees them as more than their role. They sat together as darkness settled, and Aysara felt something shift, not in her policies or strategic calculations, but in something more fundamental, in her understanding of what relationships could be when they were built on choice rather than obligation. I value what we have, she said quietly, even though I don't have proper frameworks for defining it, even though it complicates the hierarchical structure I was trained to maintain. I value it. Good, Ethan said simply. So do I. And in the growing darkness, sitting beside someone who chose to stand with her even when they disagreed, Aysara began to understand what friendship actually meant, and why it might be the most valuable relationship she'd ever have. A year into their marriage, Aysara faced a crisis that would test not just her political authority, but the nature of her relationship with Ethan. A coalition of conservative nobles, led by Elder Veyrath and his faction, launched a formal legal challenge to her governance. The stated grounds were constitutional. By allowing her human consort too much influence over policy decisions, she had violated ancient provisions designed to prevent foreign interference in Thalvarian sovereignty. It was political theater masking a power struggle, conservative factions seeking to constrain her progressive reforms and reassert traditional hierarchies, where human influence was minimized and noble prerogatives were protected. The challenge became brutally public. Every decision where Ethan had provided input was scrutinized. Every policy discussion they'd had was analyzed for evidence of improper foreign influence. Every public appearance together was cited as proof that she'd elevated him beyond his appropriate ceremonial role. The conservative faction's argument was clear. The Queen had allowed personal attachment to compromise political judgment. She had permitted a foreign consort, bound to her by strategic marriage, obligated to support Thalvarian interests, to become something more, something that compromised her authority and undermined proper governance. Aysara's own loyal advisers, recognizing the political danger, suggested the obvious solution. Ethan should withdraw from any active role in governance, maintain the marriage for its diplomatic benefits, but reduce him to purely ceremonial functions. Remove him from strategy sessions, policy discussions, any situation where his counsel might be perceived as influence. It was the politically sensible approach that would diffuse the crisis while maintaining the alliance's benefits. When Aysara presented this option to Ethan in the privacy of her study, he agreed immediately. "If my active involvement is creating political problems for you, I'll step back. The marriage can continue formally while I return to strictly ceremonial duties. Whatever helps you navigate this most effectively." It was the right answer, the politically mature response, the solution that preserved both the alliance and Aysara's authority. And Aysara found herself feeling something entirely unexpected: loss. Not at losing a useful advisor, she had many competent advisors. Not at losing political advantage. The marriage would still provide diplomatic benefits regardless of Ethan's active role. Loss at the thought of not having Ethan's perspective during strategy sessions. Not having his company in the observatory garden during evening conversations. Not having his friendship, that chosen bond she'd come to value beyond any political utility it provided. "I don't want you to withdraw," she heard herself saying, surprising herself with the intensity of her own response. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "Aysara, if you choose that path, it makes this crisis significantly harder to resolve. The conservative factions won't back down if you're openly prioritizing our partnership over their constitutional concerns. Let them challenge me." Aysara stood, pacing her study with energy that felt almost foreign after years of controlled composure. "I have spent 15 years making every decision based purely on political calculation and strategic advantage. Every relationship structured around utility. Every connection measured by what it provides rather than what it means." She stopped, turning to face Ethan directly. "Perhaps it's time I made a choice based on what I actually value rather than what's merely strategically optimal. And I value what we have, this friendship, this partnership, this relationship built on mutual choice rather than political obligation. I'm not surrendering that to appease nobles who want to constrain my authority." "That's a significant political risk," Ethan said quietly. "I know, I'm choosing it anyway." The crisis played out over 3 intense months. Aysara defended her right to seek counsel from her consort, arguing that competence and earned trust mattered more than traditional restrictions based on origin or status. She presented evidence of improved governance outcomes, successful policy implementations, enhanced diplomatic relationships, all areas where Ethan's input had proven valuable. The conservative faction pushed back hard, citing precedent and tradition, and the principle that queens should not be constrained by personal attachments. They portrayed Ethan as foreign influence corrupting proper Thalvarian governance, and Aysara as a ruler compromised by inappropriate emotional connection. Through it all, Ethan remained actively involved despite knowing he was the target. He provided counsel knowing it would be used as evidence against Aysara. He attended strategy sessions despite conservative protests. He stood beside her publicly when the politically smart move would have been strategic absence. The resolution was typical political compromise. Aysara retained explicit authority to consult Ethan on policy matters, but with increased transparency requirements about which decisions were influenced by his input. The conservative nobles gained procedural constraints, formal documentation, oversight mechanisms, but failed to remove Ethan from meaningful influence. It satisfied no one completely, which meant it was probably the best available outcome. But for Aysara, the resolution of the crisis was less significant than what she'd learned during it. When her authority was questioned, and titles meant nothing because her right to rule was being challenged, Ethan stayed. Not because duty required it. He could have withdrawn with complete justification and probably saved his own reputation. Not because it was politically advantageous. His involvement was literally the source of the crisis. He stayed because he chose to, because their friendship mattered to him beyond formal bonds or political utility. After the crisis formally resolved and governance returned to something approximating normal routine, Aysara found Ethan in the observatory garden at sunset. It had become their place, sacred through repeated choice rather than formal designation. She sat beside him on the stone bench, and they watched the sky change colors in comfortable silence that didn't require filling. "I've been thinking extensively about friendship," Aysara said finally. "About what it means to value someone beyond their utility and strategic advantage. By traditional Thalvarian cultural standards, it's inefficient, provides no measurable strategic benefit, creates political vulnerabilities, complicates rational decision-making." "That's true," Ethan agreed, not looking away from the sunset. And I've decided that efficiency isn't the supreme value in this particular domain. These past months, you've become important to me in ways that transcend political alliance or advisory utility. I value your presence, your perspective, your company. I value you, not Queen's consort Ethan who provides useful counsel, but Ethan who chooses to stand beside me even when it's politically costly." She paused, then continued carefully. "I believe what I'm experiencing aligns with human friendship, though my culture provides inadequate frameworks for properly acknowledging it. But regardless of vocabulary, the experience itself has become one of the most significant aspects of my existence." Ethan finally turned to look at her, and his expression held warmth that had nothing to do with political calculation. "Then we'll continue experiencing it. Friendship doesn't require cultural frameworks or official recognition. It just requires two people choosing to value each other beyond what they provide." "You've taught me that through your actions," Aysara said quietly. "You stayed when political wisdom said you should withdraw. You challenged me when agreement would have been easier. You valued me as Aysara, not just as Queen Aysara who provides alliance benefits. That's friendship, choosing someone's company beyond what they can offer, remaining present not from duty but from genuine care." "That's exactly what it is," Ethan agreed. "And for what it's worth, you choosing to defend our partnership despite political cost, that taught me something too, that you value this relationship as much as I do. That it's not just me choosing you, it's mutual choice, which makes it even more valuable." They sat together as darkness settled over the garden, and Aysara felt something she'd never quite experienced before. Complete certainty that regardless of political circumstances or strategic considerations, this person beside her would remain. Not from obligation, not from advantage, but from simple choice renewed daily through small acts of genuine care. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for staying, for being my friend, for teaching me that the most profound bonds aren't the ones imposed by duty or circumstance, but the ones we choose freely." "Thank you for letting me," Ethan replied. "For being open to a relationship your culture doesn't traditionally recognize. For choosing companionship even when efficiency argued against it. For valuing me beyond what I could provide." Years later, when historians analyzed the reign of Queen Aysara, they noted her successful political alliances, economic reforms, military achievements. They documented the controversial but ultimately successful partnership with her human consort. But those close to the situation understood a different story, more personal, more profound. A queen raised to value only utility learned to value companionship. A diplomat who accepted an assignment as duty discovered genuine friendship. Together, they proved that the most meaningful bonds aren't built on power or advantage, but on choice and mutual regard. A decade after their political marriage, a young Thalvarian scholar interviewed Aysara for a cultural study on human influence on Thalvarian society. Your Majesty, how would you characterize your relationship with consort Ethan? Aysara considered carefully. Formally, he is my consort and senior advisor, relationships well documented in official records, but personally, she paused. Personally, he is my friend. We lack precise Thalvarian vocabulary for that relationship category, which perhaps explains why it took me significant time to recognize what had developed between us. How do you define friendship? Friendship, Aysara said thoughtfully, is when someone remains present not because obligation requires it, but because they choose to. When they value your company beyond what you provide them. When they challenge you from genuine care rather than political positioning. When they stand beside you not as subject or strategic ally, but as companion who genuinely wishes to be there. She smiled slightly. I learned this from my human husband, who demonstrated that profound bonds aren't built on power or utility, but on choice and genuine mutual regard. He became my friend, and that friendship, inefficient and strategically unjustifiable as it may seem by traditional metrics, has proven more valuable than any political alliance. The interview sparked extensive cultural discussion about whether Thalvarian society's emphasis on utility and strategic relationships was missing something essential about what makes connection meaningful. Ethan, asked the same question by a human journalist, gave his characteristic simpler answer. I married a queen because duty required it. I stayed because I found a friend. Everything else, the politics, the alliances, the crises we navigated, those are just context surrounding the central truth. Two people choosing to value each other beyond what duty demands or advantage requires. That choice, renewed daily through small acts of genuine care, matters more than any treaty ever could. 20 years after their political marriage, Aysara and Ethan sat together in the observatory garden watching another sunset. Their hair had grayed, their faces showed age, but their companionship had only deepened through decades of choosing each other. Do you ever regret it? Aysara asked quietly, accepting this assignment, being bound to a queen from a culture that initially couldn't even acknowledge friendship as valid relationship category. Not for a single day, Ethan said. I spent 20 years with my closest friend,